how if we don't spend enough time talking about that, right, they often get disenfranchised, right? But our main question to this, and what we're going to talk about as a closing, right, is basically how you're going to solve these local problems as a whole, right? Because I think that something that's already been discussed, right, is that the main vulnerable, the stakeholder in this debate are countries that are disenfranchised, countries that people generally don't really care about, right? Because we think that a lot of countries obviously see women as second-class citizens, right? Which is obviously why their priority is to have a feminist movement, right? But we think that if you don't have that international backing, there's no incentive for you to actually, there's no incentive for a government to actually create change as a whole, right? So that's the main thing we're going to talk about today, right? About how we think that international scrutiny is extremely important, and we're going to extend on why we think that it's also important that we basically highlight the similarities between countries, right? So basically, first of all, why do we basically obviously concede the fact that obviously countries have nuances, right? That no two countries are exactly the same, right? But obviously, as a responsibility to trade off this, right? Because first of all, we think that in feminism, the struggles of women are often vast and universal, right? Because we think that a lot of the themes that surround feminism, such as gender pay gap, such as domestic violence, or people just not having the same equal opportunities or rights as men in general, are generally quite universal, right? So obviously, we have to consider the fact they're not exactly the same, right? But we think that this obviously brings the feminist movement together because when women know that other countries in other parts of the world are suffering from the same things as them, they have a bigger incentive to care about this, which is something I'm going to be talking about later, right? And also, first of all, this is going to be our extension on why we think that our goal of solidarity and unity is going to be achieved on our side of the house, and why we're willing to trade off this, prioritizing very small nuances for the sake of prioritizing whatever unique struggles they have. And we think that secondly, we think that the separation of feminist ideals and general goals are not as different as they try to make it out to be, right? Because we think that obviously we already talked about how feminism has a lot of similar core ideals, right? But also we have to recognize the fact that in a lot of countries that are in the same region, right, they generally suffer from the same problems, right? Such as countries which are, such as Muslim countries which generally tend to oppress women, right? Or countries who countries who basically tend to not give them the same opportunities. We think that they do have the same struggles, and basically it's not true to say that they're completely different, and that ignoring these nuances will completely ignore these problems as a whole, right? So basically, we think that obviously as an example, women in Pakistan and women in India having similar struggles is obviously a benefit to this, and we think that this is something that should be included in the feminist movement, right? Okay. So moving on to my extension, right? We think that feminist movement is there to create change, right? We think that that's their whole purpose, right? Their purpose is to create change, is to set in precedents in their country for change to be made, right? So basically, how do you think that you get this change, right? Because we're talking about disenfranchised countries, because we're obviously not prioritizing America since they already have such a huge feminist movement in their country, right, already. We think that how are you going to get this change, right? You need international scrutiny, you need a coalition to back you up to basically create the change that the government actually cares about what you're talking about, right? Because we think that governments are more likely to create change when there's scrutiny from the international community, when there are people pressuring them to do something, especially when we're talking about countries that generally don't see women as worthy of change, right? As worthy to even listen to in the first place, right? Because we're talking about smaller countries where feminism is a lot less less franchised and put in the spotlight. We think that obviously policies such as sanctions and basically international scrutiny in general will help to mitigate this. And yes,
how is international scrutiny necessarily the tipping point over proximate beliefs? I.e., even if US pressures Uganda, why does Uganda still stone gaze to that, for example?
We think that even though that pressure happens, right, it's because of the fact that there's a lot less people who actually in their country actually want to change it, right? And we think that if you do actually compare these two cases where you have an isolated feminist movement that only cares about their own struggles, right? Where you don't have the support of the international community, there's obviously no incentive for government to care, right? And we think that governments do have an incentive to care because obviously they want this trade, right? They want support from the international community, and they don't want all these scrutiny that comes by not implementing all these feminist ideals and demands, right? So basically, why do we think that this is likely? We think that this goes into my extension. Why we think that this is likely to happen, right? Because we think that when you do want to create these sanctions, like you obviously have to bring these issues closer together. Sorry, we do want to bring these issues closer together. Okay, and first of all, we think that this looks like the fact that a lot of women or a lot of people in general just don't care about a problem if it's not close to them. Because I think like a very obviously painfully clear example of this is climate change. Right? I think that even though we know what climate change is, right, we know what it is. We've obviously, I think we've at least all of us have at least heard of it in some point of our lives. We don't really have an incentive to care about it because of the fact that it's so geographically far away from Malaysia, or the fact that it's such an abstract topic in general that people just generally don't care about it. Right? I think that the same thing applies to feminism, which is exactly why we have to concede to the fact that even though nuances exist, we need to prioritize these bigger problems to actually create a change in feminism in general, right? So basically, sorry. We think that obviously this looks like the fact that a lot of women are just generally just don't care about countries that people already don't care about countries that are just generally not heard of in the international community in general, right? Because we think that not only that do they not care or not know about what's happening, right? They just don't have any incentive to care about a problem if it's not related to what they're struggling with. And this is basically our main extension. When you have similar issues, when you can basically have solidarity with women who suffer from the same issues as you, from women who suffer from pain, from women who suffer from domestic violence, right? This is something that you can relate to. This is something that's universal. And this is something that will actually incentivize like the general global feminist movement to care about what you're talking about. So okay, I think I'm over time. I'm gonna wrap up as a whole, right? So we've basically given you extensions on why we think international scrutiny is extremely important. Right? We've talked about the fact about why we need this global cooperation and why we think that in general women just don't care if it's not related to them, if it's not related to what's happening, right? And thirdly, we've basically conceded and we've also rebutted the fact that nuances exist, right? And basically said why a best case scenario